Hello, and thank you for coming along. Today we're going to look at a short overview of emerging digital technologies for research and teaching in African history and cultural studies. We're going to bring up a few case studies and discuss some of the innovative practices that are now occurring around the world. First, we're going to look at individual and institutional digital conservation and the research projects surrounding them in reference to maps, prints, photos, documents of any kind. Then we're going to look at how Google Earth can be of use to us all. Finally, we're going to look at how new forms of collaboration and consortia are emerging between universities and, in some cases, their own museums on campus. Then we're going to look at how this is combined with public access community television in powerful ways to, in effect, get the word out about African history and see how it's diffused through YouTube. And finally, how that can be communicated both in teaching general classes at all levels through the use of QR codes and outreach programs from individual African studies programs, history departments, or cultural studies and global history departments. All of this can add up to quite an extraordinary array of powerful techniques and tools to be used at all levels of teaching. Question is whether it can be realized as the digital technology gets more and more generally available. It can be realized at very powerful levels. To begin with, then, consider the maps, and also by extension, of course, prints of any kind, photos and documents. For a number of years, there's been an international group of scholars looking at the historical maps of Africa in a group called the Africa Map Circle, which you can find out about on YouTube simply by searching for that question. Type in the question, what is the Africa Map Circle? And you'll get back something like this. That is a link to something like this where you can learn about African historical cartography and find out what's happening in this research. The African historical cartography has really taken off because of digital technology. You should check it out. What's happening is that detailed maps of the slave trade are now becoming a matter of immense interest because they indicate the kinds of things that must have been going on in Africa prior to the departure of slave ships for the New World. These can be laid on top of one another and on top of the Google Earth base and analyzed in reference to those geologic realities underneath them. The result is you can look at new features of Africa, or I should say, age-old features of Africa in a new way, like river basins and deserts, mountains and forests, all of which are rapidly changing in our climate circumstance. If you map some of the historical material on top of these geologic views from space, satellite views, you can learn a great deal, especially if you look at them in detail. That's now become possible. It's become possible because of the digitization revolution. These maps can be digitized and shaped in different ways to fit on geologic substrates, but also they can be blown up and expanded to read details barely legible in smaller sizes. and certainly not available to the general public because these are rare and fragile maps, which few people used to get access to. Now, however, with digitization undertaken in part to conserve these maps, these digitized images can be shared and examined by groups of people never previously having access to them. Take a look, for example, at what is being undertaken in the Africa Map Circle, a group of people internationally that have gotten together to share this kind of information and share their analyses of these maps. They're inspired in part by the work of Prosser Gifford, a professor of African history for a long time. He died recently in 2020, but he taught that our understanding of African history, in fact, all history, is shaped by two principal factors. First, the nature of the data we have available to interpret and discuss, and second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle to discuss it, discuss the maps, discuss the documents, and the like. That's crucial. First, the nature of the data. Second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle, as he called it, in the circle to discuss it. That's a key concept. Who's in the circle? Well, the Africa Map Circle is trying to expand the circle beyond those who had access to rare book libraries or map collections of a specialized type to a much broader range of historians, scholars, students, and the general public. The Africa Map Circle seeks to be inclusive, whereas previous collections were by intention exclusive in the sense that you needed to preserve these maps, and that meant that they were kept from the public largely and only displayed in certain occasions and under very controlled conditions. But what is the circle? Well, let's take a look at it. The Africa Map Circle is a very interesting new intellectual enterprise because you could argue that the African continent was arguably the first one in the world to be mapped in its full outline. It was circumnavigated long before the Americas, or for Australia, for example, or certainly for Asia and large parts of the Russian north, the Siberian plains. But Africa maps were made largely and created by non-Africans. Now, this is an interesting anomaly. The first continent, you could call it that, to be fully encircled and mapped, but mapped by those who weren't from the continent by and large. Therefore, Africa maps can only be understood as multicultural documents from the beginning. What are the early maps? Well, in many cases, they're transcriptions of places and names for places that were used in the local language. In other cases, they're names applied from European traditions. But which European tradition? Well, it depends upon the European group making the map. So there's a hodgepodge of different names, sometimes referring to places, sometimes referring to kingdoms, sometimes referring to names of peoples or associations of peoples or federations of tribes. Other times referring to rather mundane things like salt pans and hard rock. These maps are multicultural to begin with, and they require international and multicultural teams of students and scholars to be analyzed adequately. They can't be understood from only one linguistic tradition, for example, nor can they be fully understood if we don't understand what a place name means in the local language. Digital technology now makes it possible to share and analyze these maps around the globe. This is what's new. The maps are old, but the technology is allowing us to do new things with them. The result is that the collaborative study of African maps can now provide a new paradigm for international and multicultural teaching and learning. This is very important because the techniques devised here are not just exclusive to Africa. They can be applied to any part of the globe with any linguistic tradition. The study of Chinese maps, for example, could be undertaken in the same way that we're studying now maps in the Africa Map Circle. Study of Arabic maps of Africa, could be included in the same kind of scope, and with great results. Let's see what its intentions are. You might well ask, well, what is it? Then you could scan the QR code and find out for yourself. How can it help me? How can it help those I know learn more or teach about Africa? Well, check it out. Scan the code and begin to participate, learn more, and join in. The goals of the Africa Map Circle are pretty simple and can be outlined very quickly. First, to provide readily available public access for scholars and students to historical and contemporary maps of Africa. Second, to provide for educators and students at all levels of teaching and learning resources to use in their own research and their development of online curricula, with selected examples provided from the Africa Map Circle's own Explorations series. And 3, to inspire and encourage scholars and students to expand and extend and share these tools in developing their own online African history research and teaching in Africa, the Americas, in Europe, Asia, and in fact, throughout the world. This is the kind of thing that could facilitate the Chinese study of Africa, the study of Arab countries along the northern part of Africa, and their understanding in their own cartographic tradition of sub-Saharan Africa, their understanding of the Indian Ocean and the role that African traders played in the Indian Ocean. All of these new extensible research areas can be absorbed in what the Africa Map Circle is beginning to undertake. In the future, the Africa Map Circle will seek to provide a platform upon which to share scholarly research and novel instruction initiatives that demonstrate the creative use of maps in online teaching and learning about Africa throughout the world. So, join up, join in. The Africa Map Circle is something for the public in general to learn from and learn about. Under lockdown, which we've all experienced for the last year and a half or so, this has become particularly important because learning under lockdown has changed from the very basic levels of elementary school right up through colleges, universities, and graduate school. Everyone's had to shelter in place and hunker down in a kind of new isolationism. Africa is a huge place, but we didn't learn much about it by going there during the last 18 months. Couldn't go there. Similarly, Africans couldn't come out from the continent and tell us, as they normally have, as exchange students throughout the Western world. That lockdown has meant there's been a kind of cutoff of the usual educational process. But we've devised new tools and developed some tips for online learning about Africa and the world during this lockdown. You can get in touch with some of these through the Africa Map Circle. At the African Studies Association last year, there was a special panel devoted to this. It's called Online Research and Teaching with Africa Maps, Tips, Techniques, Examples, and Resources. And it was put together by the Africa Map Circle, coordinated by them as one of the special sessions. It was highly successful, an international meeting, and in some sense it served as a proof of concept of what could lie in store for an even more ambitious effort. What can it do for students and scholars? Well, take a look at the online research and teaching that we managed to undertake during these lockdown times. Online research and teaching with African maps was a paper presented at the ASA meeting, and you can get access to it by clicking on the resources, scanning in the code, and clicking on the paper citation. So what we're looking at is bringing into a conversation with one another, not just old maps and digital technology, but new communities, plus new narratives in African and global history. How are we doing it? Well, largely through digital communications technology, not just the digitization of individual maps and the ability to send these by email or something like that, but the ability to explore them together with virtual seminar. This is what the African Studies meeting proved last year. We could hold a virtual international seminar with people from all over the world to take part in a Zoom session where things were shared online, real time with one another. Just search for this simple question, what is the Africa Map Circle? And you'll get access to that material. Direct research with Google Earth can also be very helpful in extending the study of African history. You can call up Google Earth very simply at this web address, earth.google.com/web. When you are connected through the internet, you can browse, search, pan, and zoom in to these different images. Take, for example, the case of Ghana. If you type in Ghana in the search facility over here, click on the magnifying glass, or click on the full menu up here and enter the search tool, type in Ghana, and you can get directed to something like this. And you can learn to zoom in from the satellite view. All of these are satellite images bought by Google and presented to the world through Google Earth. You can look for something more specific, like Cape Coast, Ghana, and begin to zoom in much more directly and in a greater level of detail than a simple distance shot from a satellite. In fact, you can begin to see structures like this, which are enormous and permanent, right on the coast. What else might we learn from a closer look through Google Earth? Well, as it turns out, Google Earth is connected to Google Maps, and Google Maps allows you to create a street view. A street view of major structures like this can be very, very instructive and give students as well as teachers a new resource to begin to explore. In fact, the street view of major structures like this gives you a kind of itinerary, which you can click on and zoom in as almost a parachuter in this circumstance. Take a look. In Google Earth, it's possible to take a detailed view of a structure of this size from outer space, and you can zoom into it, and in fact, ask to see a street view of it by tapping on that icon and getting a kind of itinerary made in blue, which you can zoom in on even closer and strike a position on that blue link and be placed right within the structure involved. You can take a look and turn the image in various directions. In fact, in 360 degrees, you can see the inside of the Cape Coast Castle and how it's positioned very strategically on the coast, with all of its guns pointed out to the sea to fend off any invaders that might want to gain access to this part of the coast, which the owners of the castle clearly don't want to exceed. So you can see there's a rather impressive firearm structure with all the cannonballs behind it available to protect this large fort. And look, from here out to the ocean as a region of dominance. You can call this into focus and begin to walk around the inside of this kind of structure at any point. If you call up the particular interior court view, you can see that arrows are provided, which you can tap and make some kind of foot level progress. See all the cannonballs involved. This is the chapel under the red roof, and then beneath the chapel, an indication of the entrance to the dungeons where the male slaves were kept. If you turn around, you can take a look at the size of this enormous fort. Its history can be called up very conveniently by a document created by the Canadian Board of Monuments and Forts. If you call upon it, for example, you can call it in by searching for Cape Coast Castle. You'll be taken right here and given a little bit of a briefing on its history and importance. As you can see, it was constructed starting in 1610, and it was opened in 1643. So that's basically 43 years of construction. It was not built overnight. You can find out more of that history from the entries in Wikipedia. You click on the Wikipedia entries, you'll get a bit of a sketch of the history of this, drawn from other sources. It's important to realize that Wikipedia is not a source in itself, it's a compilation of other people's sources. And it's this history that enables you to click on the other resources to give you a more thorough historical background. But back to the Canadian contribution here, you can actually call up a series of pictures, still shots, in a kind of slideshow that's available, and then look at them one by one. Very impressive structures, very massive, said to be built by the Swedes starting in 1610. Well, not quite. It's built by the Africans, maybe under Swedish direction and guidance, and indeed mobilization of the labor force, but the labor is very clearly African and had to have been massive. to create something like that, you can look over the edge into the current town and how close it is to the ocean. But the structure of this size is not built overnight, and its walls are 8 feet thick, not to be conquered easily in the age of sail and cannons. Now it can be driven up to on the outside fairly easily, and it looks like a 3-story building from this side, but in fact it's massive. Use this digital technology as a way of getting into the information and a way of looking at things on the coast. This can be undertaken with a variety of locations throughout Ghana and Africa more generally. South Africa, East Africa, Egypt, the Sudan. But consider, for example, the case of Fort Meadowcross in Dix Cove in Ghana. Again, you can just type in Dix Cove, Ghana, or Fort Meadowcross, and you'll be taken by Google Earth to that location from the satellite view above. Satellite view on a clear day looks something like this. It varies from day to day because there are different pictures taken of the same object. So don't get discouraged if the picture looks blurry and not as clear as this one. This was taken on a particularly good moment, in a moment that was particularly well lit. But once again, you can click the option for Street View and get an itinerary to start looking around the inside of this. Take a look. You can search for other places on the coast that are known to have forts as well, including Fort Meadowcross. In Dix Cove, Ghana. And when you do that, you'll be taken right to Fort Meadowcross, which once again has a series of photos that you can look through as if it were a slideshow. This is the outside front entrance, as it were, facing down toward the village. But the steps up from the village are quite imposing. A few guns aimed in towards the villagers, but most of them, as in the other forts, are aimed out to sea, not at the villagers. And once again, you can take a look at that by asking for a zooming in, a movement to a 2D register, and a request for a street view. The street view will give you access to that same kind of capacity to take a step-by-step tour of the inside, looking out over the edge to the ocean itself, and recognizing the armaments that have been put in place to keep the other European rivals away and at bay. The insignia on these are actually quite interesting. This is George Rex, George the King of England. At the time that this fort was occupied, in the middle of the 18th century, was a time when there were a lot of wars in the colonial empires around the world. You'll remember that in 1775, the Concord Bridge in Concord, Massachusetts was the site of what became known as the shot heard around the world, fired by American settlers trying to declare their independence from King George III of England. Meanwhile, King George II and King George III were down here in the Gold Coast, obtaining slaves to be sold to acquire the money needed to pay for the German mercenary troops to defeat the American colonists. There's a lot of intertwined history which you can look at in detail on the ground, as it were, in West Africa. And I'd urge you to start zooming in on Google Earth. Get yourself oriented. Look at the entire coastline of what was then known as the Gold Coast, is now known as Ghana, right next to what's now known as the Ivory Coast, which itself is to the east of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Senegal. As you zoom out, you can see the portions of West Africa emerging, the areas that were key in the slave trade period. You can zoom into any one of these areas and begin to analyze them from space, accompanied with the capacity to look at photos left by other people or taken in these street views by those associated with Google Earth. The same can be done for the castle at Elmina in Ghana. A very extensive set of itineraries to explore. Same can be done for the fort at Exim, Fort de Santo Antonio of Exim. Very extensive views available in a similar parachute technology used in Google Earth. It can also be done for a fort at Boutre, which is really quite fascinating and very important to realize what it's like to be a ruined castle. This one has not been restored and can't be viewed from the vantage point of a tourist, but more of a forensic archaeologist. It's very useful in its approach roads as well as the details of the castle itself. In fact, the Museums and Monuments Board has documented a great deal for the public to enrich the global understanding of the slave trade history. But more work remains to be done. For example, a systematic reference work for the whole of the Ghana coast would be very useful to construct from historical documents like this one, published in France as early as 1719. This is one view of the Elmina Castle. A second view is from the other side of it and was considered so important by the French at the time that they include both views. In fact, the French produced this as a kind of catalog at the time of the different forts of English and Dutch on the coast. This one's referred to as Le Principal Château des Anglois à Cabo Coast. Cabo Coast is Cape Coast. And the details are given for both the major fort and the minor fort that protects it in the back on the side. Many digitized resources already exist to take this kind of work in hand by teachers around the world. So simply creating an online catalog of existing digitized resources could be very helpful. And this is work that can be done without any further field trips to Africa. It needs to be undertaken, especially during these times of COVID constraint, where travel is very restricted. This has been one of the objectives of the African Historical Graphics Archive, to create a kind of digital directory of these resources. Along with the ECDA, the early Caribbean digital archives, this could become a very useful digital resource in the study of world history, not just African history, not just Caribbean history, but in effect, the emergence of world history since 1492, and in fact, well before that. Further, it's now possible to combine one kind of digitized asset with another to advance research. You can place these historical maps of Africa on top of a geo-referenced substrate within Google Earth and situate them precisely in such a way that you can start to retrace in detail what the coast looked like to those who are engaged in the slave trade. When these maps are digitized at 600 dots per inch, they can be analyzed at a level never before practical for large numbers of scholars or students at all educational levels. Take, for example, a map like this, which covers the whole scope of West Africa and has a lot of annotations on it. You couldn't, even if you were in the presence of the map, see these very clearly without a magnifying glass. In fact, at the time, the author realized that an insert was necessary to deal with the level of detail that he had at his disposal. Once again, you can see the references there to the other kinds of documents we've been locating on the Cape Coast Castle. Currently, the most valuable single resource for this kind of digital research and teaching is Afroterra, the cartographic free library, available to anybody on the web at the address indicated. Dr. Gerald Rizzo founded and generously maintains this collection for the use of researchers and teachers from all over the digital world. If you have access to the internet, you have access to his enormous and very historically valuable library. With access to resources like these, we can zoom in to the digital image of this 1753 original map to see what we might be able to learn from it. In addition, individual documents like this map of West Africa can be digitized to the scale of 600 dots per inch, which is very refined in the sense of precise. And you can start to zoom in for that reason and see the map in great detail. This one was created in 1753 with explanatory notes of all the forts and settlements belonging to the several European powers, as you can see. The notes are quite detailed and they're numbered. It's worth looking through them in detail. They start number 1 up here and continue, each representing an entry for a fort along the coast, which is numbered. And therefore you can see what it's referring to precisely. Dick's Cove, which we have heard about, is number 12, Axim number 10. There's also an indication of the trade routes down to the coast from a place known as the Ashanti and a place, seems to be a town, entitled Okumasi, later known as Kumasi. There's so much going on in this coast, in fact, in the Gold Coast and Ouida, that even the maker in 1753 thought it was necessary to create an insert, which was kind of an innovation at the time, as he says, a separate map of the Gold Coast upon a larger scale. This enables us to see in much greater detail the different forts, each with a flag of its own nationality, up and down the coast of this very small section of the Africa coast as a whole. At its height, there were somewhere between 70 and 80 different forts along this stretch of coast. And you can see from this map that there's further detail provided about the interior, the trade routes, the towns that are reached in the interior, all the way up to Kumasi. In addition, there's a very interesting inclusion of a piece of information about the currents. It says here, a strong current sets to the eastward, excepting in the Harmattan season, about January, when it sets the contrary way. Very interesting. This accounts for some of the different periods of the year when it's easier for the merchants to take slaves to the New World, because it's hard to move a ship against the current. But when the current is in your favor, you can make swift progress. So the mariners, the merchants, and the military made very good use of the winds, the tides, and the currents to make their trips to the New World most expeditiously and with greater profit margins. For this reason, it's very useful to study this map in detail and to see what towns, villages, and areas were included in the region, including the Kingdom of Dahomey, the coast of Ouida, the Benin Kingdom, and the Calabar region in Nigeria. All of these have very detailed annotations and deserve to be studied at length. This is the kind of thing that's made possible and is starting to be used by the Africa Map Circle, because it's now feasible to hold seminars on different regions of the coast with great detailed maps from the period. Seminars are international in scope and in fact depend a great deal upon the African participants who can in fact tell us what some of the place names mean in ways we've never been able to make sense of in the Western world in previous pre-digital studies. It is clear that we can learn a lot from a close, almost forensic examination of the digitized image of this map. And even within one collection, Dr. Gerald Rizzo's collection, there are hundreds more maps like this. In addition, the Africa Map Circle points to many further maps in different collections. As it turns out, this 1753 map proved to be a very important map in African history, but in American history as well. The full context of the history of this map is important to establish and discuss with students and other researchers. A picture of this map appears in a book recently published called A History of America in 100 Maps. Now, what would a map about West Africa have to do with the history of America in 100 maps? Well, Susan Schulten, the author of the book, makes it clear. This was very important. Why? Well, it's a great question, and she answers it by looking at the importance of West Africa for both the slave traders at the time and for the abolitionists. A map like this, in effect, documents the scale and scope of the horror of the slave trade. So it was used both simultaneously to encourage further participation in the slave trade by building additional forts and to opposed the slave trade, documenting the horrific scale of the use of forts along this whole area in West Africa. Even a half century before the 1753 map, another kind of map started to appear, and it's very interesting to look at in detail, which you can do by zooming in through Dr. Gerald Rizzo's collection, Afroterra. You can begin to see that these are the first ethnographic, if you want to call it that, or political maps made by Europeans. In this case, the French started to label and even paint some of the borders of constituencies they thought existed at the time. Here's where the collaboration of African historians is absolutely essential, because some of these names and places are inaccurate and need to be revised on the best understandings that are available from African historians. But you can see how this is an aspect of Africa's global history. Look, for example, at the Fredericksburg Castle, indicated here with a question mark, as in the French, au Brandenburg, where the Brandenburgs, the Brandenburg Empire, began to express its presence in West Africa. That's to say, the Germans, for the first time, constructed an onshore fort directly related to the Brandenburg family, which at the same time was sponsoring such developments as the Brandenburg concertos of Bach in Western Europe, financed in part by the profits from the Brandenburg Castle in West Africa. In addition to what can be called digital zooming, for detailed study of maps, prints, pictures, and other primary documents, there's another meaning of zooming that has become central in African studies. And that is the Zoom meeting. Zoom meeting technology has revolutionized the nature of global educational exchange for both research and teaching. With technologies like Zoom for remote teaching and collaborative research, new forms of learning are now blossoming across the globe. As in this case, for example, where they discussed the exploration of world cultures through the digital humanities at Yale. As one teacher put it, when everyone teaches, everyone learns, and everyone can start to teach with the material available online through digital collections at places like Yale. One question the maps raise has to do with the prior plantations in Africa. When you think of it, millions of people traveling for thousands of miles over hundreds of years had to be fed just to be kept alive. The conditions were very squalid and sordid, but they had to have a food supply in order to be able to be sellable in the New World at auction. Where did the food come from? For, as they say, millions of people traveling thousands of miles over hundreds of years, this is a not insubstantial amount of food production that came largely from prior plantations that had to have existed in Africa for the production of food. Where were these prior plantations? It's a bit of a mystery. In effect, if you look at the different portions which the historians have now been able to assign in the contributions of different regions of Africa to the transatlantic trade over the entire period of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, you can learn something, but in a sense, these maps raise more questions than they answer. Only 2% went to North America at the time. Most of them went to the Caribbean or straight to Brazil and South America. But if you think of that, you would expect that most of the food production would have been behind the areas that the slaves were taken from. However, we don't know a lot about that prior plantation structure. We can learn something about it from the digital archives of other prints, like this one, based on a source from 1727. It shows the inside of the Cape Coast Castle, at this point under the control of the British. There are things like floor plans, which can be looked at. And up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see another insert map, which is very valuable and important to study on a detailed level. Take a look, for example, at the floor plan of the castle itself, where it tells you where the warehouses are and the apartments. These are euphemisms. But the warehouses are where the food was stored. And if you look in detail at where it was produced, you learn a great deal more. Here's the outline of the castle itself. But you see here, Cape Coast Gardens are far more extensive than just the area of the castle itself. In fact, they're enormous, with indication of different kinds of crops being grown, and as they call it, an orange walk. The orange walk is number M here, which is where the oranges were grown, in effect, to prevent scurvy among the crew and captives in the transatlantic trade. Well, if you map that on current day Ghana, here's the outline of the Cape Coast Castle. This whole area would have been engaged in agricultural production. That's a massive amount of resources, in a sense, being mobilized for this trade. And there needs to be a useful examination of this kind of thing, in part because it'll lead to understanding a little bit more about the history that is written in stone in some respects. We can think of the castles as statements written in stone, but they themselves didn't spontaneously emerge. They were built. A recent poem by Bertolt Brecht after World War II reminds us that there are some important questions we've never asked when we say things like this was built by the British, or this was built by the Swedes, or this was built by the Dutch. You really have to ask the question from the point of view of the workers. He wrote a poem entitled A Worker Reads History, a few lines of which are very riveting in their implication. As he points out, who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books were filled with the names of kings. Was it kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? Well, you can bet it wasn't the kings. And you can bet it wasn't the king's underlings. It had to do with slave labor from the beginning. So the story that has already been written in stone in West Africa has a labor history behind it, which ought to be investigated. In fact, you could ask the question about the food production as well. What was the role, location, and magnitude of the prior plantations in Africa needed to fuel the building of the infrastructure for and supply the needs of the Atlantic trade? How did Africa's industrious revolution launch Europe and America's industrial revolution? It was an industrious revolution in Africa because an enormous amount of work was involved, without the use of draft animals for the most part. That is, it was industrious on the part of human labor. And it's that which needs to be documented in greater detail at this point. The Ghana Museums and Monuments Board has done an excellent job of looking at the forts and castles, but the question of agriculture has yet to be investigated in great depth. There's some work, very important work, on the commercial agriculture, the slave trade and slavery in the Atlantic. But what about the non-commercial agriculture? Agriculture that was engendered and generated upon the prior plantations. It wasn't commercial, didn't have to do with cash and carry transactions where people were paid. It had to do with slave labor at work at the time in the shadow of these forts. A very valuable and important study has been put together and edited by Ghanaian historians on the shadows of empire, as they called it, New Perspectives on European Fortifications. And we're learning more and more about the archaeology of these fortifications themselves. But what about the agriculture that made it possible to build these fortifications? Well, some people have started to look into this. An exhibit was held not long ago at Harvard on maps, stones, and plants, looking at them as agents of empire and the ecology of the Atlantic trade. But the fact is, we haven't done the archaeology on the ethnobotany of the region. And in fact, as one observer pointed out, for every ton of digging done in the archaeology of the Middle East, there's been a teaspoon undertaken in Africa. That's the ratio. For every ton of material uncovered in the Middle East, revealing what's beneath ever since Napoleon, there's been a teaspoon unearthed in West Africa. The ratios are clearly out of whack and need, in a sense, to be rectified. Some of this was addressed in a conference last month on recovering the looted past. In fact, it occurred earlier this month, online, with the exchange of digital information internationally. There is a new amount of archaeology of Africa being undertaken, but it's looking at not so much the structures as the food, the metals, and the town. This can be undertaken with great advantage in the coming years. And it's led some people to look at the troubling chapters in the political ecology and history of West African agriculture. Some of these lectures and research seminars have looked at the prior plantations, legitimate trade, cash crop exports, and current farmland grabs that have taken place over the course of history in West Africa. Fortunately, some leading African universities have taken the initiative to demonstrate the value of international collaboration in African studies. Department of History at the University of Cape Coast issued a call for papers, and other similar conferences may well be convened in the future. This was a very useful conference on repatriation in Africa, the African diaspora, and other global contexts, histories, practices, understandings, and constructions. Similarly, the year before, the African Studies Association held its annual meetings for the last 2 years, in fact, as virtual events. During the 2020 conference, the ASA members were provided with a how-to set of instructions to obtain digital map resources for online research, and other tools were shared as well because of the learning that had to take place under lockdown. We were all under the constraints of an international lockdown. So the tools for digital research were expanded. These kinds of collaborative meetings can now take place between and within universities. And it's important to point out the within universities, because there's new kind of collaboration taking place between universities on one hand, but also within universities. There's different kinds of assets in any one university, and many of them have museums, for example, that haven't traditionally been in touch with their history departments or with their African studies departments. But under digital conditions that were imposed during the lockdown, people began to look around inside the university for other things that could be useful in teaching. Then, of course, there's different kinds of collaboration across universities and with other professional research groups outside the university, like the Africa Map Circle. The Zoom revolution has changed the nature of global educational exchange everywhere, not just in universities, but at the secondary school level as well. And groups like the Africa Map Circle now can be available to groups both inside and outside the university. In addition, digital innovation is constantly evolving through the public access of community television. These stations throughout the United States were created as a result of the cable television system. Cable providers had to provide for each community that gave them a license a public access community television facility. These have been combined very usefully in some cases with YouTube channels, where broadcasts made on the community television have been recorded and kept in little archives in the YouTube environment, which are accessible by anybody with access to the internet. Further, there's been an emergence of QR codes for instant communication. These are now widely generated and available for communicating masses of information, lecture series, seminar discussions, and the like. So, this short overview of digital technologies for research and teaching has focused upon individual and institutional digital conservation, plus the use of Google Earth, plus the university consortia and museums that have emerged, and the public access television, the YouTube archival capacity, and the capacity for teaching and outreach possible through the dissemination of QR codes, which can be placed anywhere, including on advertisements in bus stations or train stations or anywhere. So the possibilities are enormous, but the realization of this has to do with grassroots activity, people drawing upon the available digital material. The availability of QR codes and their universal distribution can now revolutionize education about and within Africa and elsewhere in the world. The QR code and digital revolution of assets is likely to change the awareness of new generations of students throughout the world who can learn about and contribute to our understanding of African culture and history.